Are we victims of our genetics? Is your destiny predetermined? Ever since the principles of genetics were discovered in 1866, there's been a notion that genes determine the future of your health and the character of your life. We've all heard someone say, "This disorder runs in my family," which stems from the idea that diseases are caused by genetics. There is a gene called the BRCA1 gene, which is associated with breast cancer. 50% of women with this gene end up getting breast cancer. To find out you have this gene is typically very upsetting news because many perceive it as a death sentence. But half the women with the BRCA1 gene do not get cancer. This begs the question, what is the difference between the ones that get the cancer and the ones that don't? And the answer is environment and mindset. While there are some rare diseases that are onset at birth, over 99% of illness, disease, and disorders manifest later in life. Our environment shapes our mind, and our mind produces chemicals that trigger which genes get expressed. So genes correlate to disease, but they are not the cause of disease, and they do not control biology. With this information, we are no longer victims. We have the power to change our mindset. We have free will. If we use our conscious mind, we can rise above our subconscious programs and write a new destiny for ourselves. Like Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. If we want to forge a new path for ourselves, it starts with a new mindset. So with that, we have another episode from the original Gaia series, Rewired, with Dr. Joe Dispenza. In this presentation, he will explain how to develop new thought patterns, reprogram your genes, heal your body, and step into a new state of being. We hope you all enjoy.
You've probably heard the expression, "as above, so below." This is a truth that I've discovered in my own research. What if you were able to create an inner experience in your mind that carries an amplitude of energy or emotion that's greater than a highly charged emotional experience in your past, which could cause your body to literally respond to a new mind? Is it possible that combining a clear intention in your mind with an elevated emotion in your body, you can move your brain and body out of the past and into a new future? I realized that patients that were able to create an inner experience that was greater than their past experiences were able to change the future of their bodies. In a sense, they changed their genetic destiny. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Dispenza, and in the previous episode, we went into depth on the different types of brainwaves. In this episode, we're going to discover the power of your mind and how it can change your gene expression. I want to dispel the myth around genes and introduce you to a new science called epigenetics. It's my hope that this information will help you understand how to improve your life from the inside out. Let's begin with some simple biology. Think of your body as a protein-producing machine. Muscle cells make muscle proteins called actin and myosin. Skin cells make skin proteins called collagen and elastin. Stomach cells make stomach proteins called enzymes. Your immune system makes immune proteins called immunoglobulins or antibodies. Your eye cells make eye proteins called keratin. And every single cell in your body, except red blood cells, make proteins. And the expression of proteins is the expression of life, because proteins are responsible for the structure and the function of your body. In order for a cell to make proteins, a gene has to be stimulated or regulated. So what are genes then? Think about genes as a library of potentials. And so there was a myth after the human genome was discovered that genes create disease. But if you study the research, less than 1% of people on the planet are born with genetic conditions, early onset genetic conditions like Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia, type 1 diabetes. The other 99% is created from lifestyle, behavior, and choices. So in order for a cell to make a protein, a gene has to be regulated. So then, if you understand then that genes don't create disease and the expression of proteins comes from genes being regulated, then what is causing genes to become regulated or stimulated? Well, the latest research in the field called epigenetics says that genes don't create disease. It's the environment that signals the gene that begins to create disease. But it begs the question, how can two factory workers working side by side, both exposed to the same carcinogenic chemical, one gets cancer and the other doesn't? Surely there must be some internal order in that person's body that's greater than the conditions in their environment. And in a sense then, the inner environment of the body is still the outer environment of the cell. So then, it's not genes that create disease, it's our reaction to the environment, or better yet, how we begin to look at the environment that influences our emotional state. And it's our emotions then that have a key factor in sending signals to cause genes to upregulate or what we call downregulate. Now, genes are like Christmas tree lights. They're turning on and off all the time. But in a sense, they're not turning on and off. They're getting regulated or they're getting instructions from the environment outside of the cell. And when they get the proper instructions, when the gene gets upregulated, it makes a healthy protein. When the cell is getting information to cause it to contract or limit its metabolic productions, it begins to downregulate and it starts making a cheaper protein. So then, if the environment signals the gene, and the end product of an experience in your environment is called an emotion, is it possible then that you can signal the gene ahead of the environment? We learned in previous episodes that the stronger the emotion that you feel from some experience in your life, the more altered you feel inside of you, the more you narrow your focus on the cause, and the brain freezes the image, and that's called the memory. And we said that people think neurologically within the circuits of those past experiences, and they think chemically within the boundaries of those emotions. And how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. So in a sense, highly charged emotional events can possibly signal genes that begin to cause the body to change. So then, if a person is waking up every morning and searching for the familiar feeling that they call themselves, the moment they get in touch with that feeling that's familiar to them, and those feelings are influencing their thoughts, and those thoughts are creating more of the same chemicals that create the same feelings, then if they're living by the same emotion, it makes sense they're stimulating the same genes in the same way every single day, and now they're headed for a genetic destiny. Because there's no new information coming from the environment that could possibly begin to select or instruct new genes. And in fact, if you look at two identical twins, both sharing the same genome, why is it that one dies at 54 and the other dies at 86? Obviously, it's their interaction in the environment, the choices that they make, the behaviors that they demonstrate, how they respond to stress, how resilient they are to return back to homeostasis. And in fact, it's their interaction in the environment that's selecting and instructing gene expression. Now think about this. When they began to map the human genome, they said, okay, the body makes about 100,000 proteins, which means there should be 100,000 genes for each one of those proteins. We have 40 genes that are called regulatory proteins or regulatory genes that assist in making those proteins. So now 100,000 plus 40,000 makes 140,000 proteins, and there should be 140,000 genes. But when they mapped the human genome, they found out that we only express, as human beings, 23,688 genes. So then how is it possible then that we have more proteins that make up our body than we have genes to make them? Because on one single gene, there can be thousands of different variations that begin to cause the cell to begin to make different types of proteins. So then the expression of proteins is the expression of life. And so if people are living in the routine of the predictable future, or they're memorized to emotions of their past and they can't think or act greater than how they feel, then those series of events in their lives has began to influence their gene expression. Then once the gene has been signaled and the person is constantly living out of homeostasis or balance, that imbalance becomes their new balance, and now the internal environment of their body is sending specific signals to the cells, and the cells are getting the same instructions, and the same instructions produce the same proteins, and now the person begins to experience ill health or disease. So I became very interested in this topic because I started reading research where scientists were taking people that had type 2 diabetes and exposing them to an hour of comedy. And when they rated the comedy show, many of the participants rated the show on a scale of 1 to 5, a 5, which means for a whole entire hour they laughed. But what they were measuring before and after the comedy show caught my attention, because they were measuring gene expression to see if changing their emotional state was able to, in 1 hour, select and instruct new genes. And in fact, over 20 genes were upregulated just by people changing their mood. So by changing their internal state, they were able to select and instruct new genes that made new proteins. People began to function with diabetes within a normal range or slightly elevated blood sugar levels compared to where their blood sugar levels were every single day. So it caused me to think, okay, if I could take a group of people and measure their gene expression, and for 4 days, ask them to think differently, to make different choices, to have new experiences, and to elevate their emotional state, would it be possible that in 4 days they can begin to change their gene expression? So we selected 32 people in a randomized study. We did some tests to take some cells out of the inside of their mouth, and we wanted to do measurements before they started a workshop, and then we wanted to take another measurement to begin to see if there was a change. And we were measuring 7,500 different gene expressions. That meant that when they stepped outside of routine, when they traded certain emotions for elevated emotions, by beginning to change their inner state, would they be able to signal the gene ahead of the environment? Now, what we found was that in 4 days, the gene that makes new neurons in response to learning and novel experiences was activated. The gene for cellular repair that stimulated stem cells, those transitional cells that go to damaged tissues and repair them, was activated, so there was regeneration going on in the body. The gene for oxidative stress was upregulated so the body could move back into normal health and balance. And antioxidants, anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, anti-neurodegenerative, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, that gene was signaled. The gene to build cellular structures, the cytoskeleton of the cell, was activated. More integrity, more regeneration in the cell. 3 genes were activated that began to suppress cancer growth in tumors. And the genes for hormonal balance, metabolic function, and metabolic order were all stimulated within 4 days. 8 genes upregulated. These are all the genes that were activated or upregulated within just 4 days. So it makes sense then, you're not doomed by your genes, that you are your own genetic engineer. So in our workshops around the world, we see many people reverse very serious health conditions like Parkinson's disease or MS or lupus or even rare genetic disorders that medical science really has no solution for. So in order for me to understand how that was possible, By studying gene expression, we now know then that when people begin to heal, they're upregulating new genes and they're downregulating genes that have to do with disease or imbalance. So then I started thinking, is it possible by teaching people how to self-regulate and begin to change their inner state, could it lengthen their life in some way? Is it possible that meditation or contemplative practices on a daily basis could influence a person's future by adding days to their life? So we did another study, and that study was in Palm Springs, California in 2017. And what we did is we randomly selected 32 people, and then we asked these 32 people to commit for 5 days out of a week doing some type of meditation for at least 60 days. But all we wanted them to do is to begin to self-regulate and change their inner state. Now, what we were looking to measure were telomeres. Now, telomeres are the tiny little shoestrings on the end of your DNA. And every time a cell divides, and cells divide about 50 to 75 times, the cell begins to shave off a little bit of that shoestring. Now, stress and the hormones of stress actually accelerate the degeneration of the telomeres and the length of those telomeres. So you can determine a person's biological age, which may be in complete contrast to their chronological age. So we wanted to see then, is it possible that telomeres could actually lengthen and a person could lengthen their life or extend their life in some way? So what we found was 5 people discontinued doing the meditations, which left 27. 20 out of 27 people lengthened their telomeres, which is about 74% of the study. 11 out of the 27 people increased their telomeres by more than 0.05%. It's 40% of the people in the study, and that adds about 4 to 8 days of their life if they live to at least 75. 6 out of the 27 people significantly increased their telomeres between 0.1 and 0.26%. That's 22% of the people involved in the study lengthened their life between 8 to 16 days. Now check this out. One person in the study increased their telomere length within 4 days. Now, I understand that telomeres take time to grow. They're like fingernails or hair. And studies that have been done out of UCLA have shown that men with prostatic cancer, or at least early onset gene expression of possible prostatic cancer, that in 60 days, they were able to upregulate new genes for health and downregulate those genes for disease, and at the same time, they began to lengthen their telomeres. So when I talked to the scientists involved in the study, I said to them, I'm aware that telomeres take time to lengthen, but we're seeing in our workshops that people are having instantaneous change in their health during a meditation. In other words, in some way, we're seeing an instantaneous change, and everything in three-dimensional reality, for something to happen, usually takes time. But if it's energy influencing matter, and it's happening in an instant, and it's not time dependent, that energy or the quantum is influencing matter. Is it possible then that someone could change their telomere expression within 4 days if it's a quantum phenomenon? Well, the scientists paused for about a minute and finally said, theoretically, it's possible. And if one person was able to do it, I would be impressed. And I said, that's all I need. And we had one person able to significantly change their telomere length within 4 days, and that is a quantum phenomenon. So, in a sense, we made history to prove that you can lengthen your life by changing your internal state. So how do we change gene expression? When people have highly charged emotional experiences, and it begins to change their emotional state, and it changes their brain structure, it changes the mapping of their brain, how is it possible then that they can begin to select and instruct new genes and to change their health? Well, when you have an internal experience in your mind that carries an amplitude of energy that's greater than the hardwired programs in your brain and the emotional conditioning in your body, you will become biologically changed. Here's a person going along, living their normal life, and all of a sudden they have a highly charged emotional experience. That experience then wires and enriches the circuits in their brain, and it begins to send the chemical emotional signal to their body. And it's that chemical emotional signature to the body that begins to change the person's state of being. Why? Because we could say their body and brain are now in the past, and that event has changed them biologically. So how are they going to change the biology of their circuitry, their neurochemistry, their hormone expression, and even their gene expression? What happens for most people is they begin to create beliefs about themselves and their lives from past experiences. They are the thoughts neurologically and the feelings chemically that they embrace within the biology of their past experiences, which ultimately becomes their state of being. Because how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. So then when a person has an inner experience in the present moment that carries an amplitude of energy, or the emotion inwardly is greater than the shock or the betrayal from the past, it makes sense then when the emotional quotient is greater than the past experience, it's going to begin to rewire the brain and send a new emotional signature, beginning to condition the body in that present moment to a new mind. And we could say then, your biology literally changes, or better yet, the past no longer exists. Now I want to tell a story to be able to bring this all together. We had a 72-year-old woman come to a week-long event in Vancouver, British Columbia, and this woman was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is a deficiency in dopamine in the brain. And when there's not enough dopamine in the brain, all of a sudden, the upper motor neurons in the brain can't communicate very well with each other, and the effect it begins to produce involuntary tremors and this type of paralysis called spastic paralysis. You see a limitation in motor function, or when a person tries to move, they have these involuntary tremors. Try as they may to control it with their conscious mind, they can't. And in fact, a lot of times when they get anxious or nervous, their tremors or their condition amplifies. Now, that is a gene that has been downregulated. So then, this woman, in one meditation, had one inner experience that literally was so profound, it was so elevated, that when she came back to her senses, she literally began to express different proteins. In a sense, she changed her body by thought alone. And so we brought her onto the stage, and her condition before this event was that she couldn't swallow, she couldn't chew her food, she had saliva constantly running off of her mouth, she had to consistently use a tissue, and she couldn't stand up. After that one inner event that carried an amplitude of energy that was greater than the hardwired programs in her brain and the normal emotional feelings that she felt on a daily basis, we could say that in that moment, genes began to become upregulated and new information was coming into her body. She stood on the stage and she said, after all these years, all the therapies, all the different drugs, all the different surgeries that I had, nothing seemed to change this condition. And now I can speak better, I can chew my food, I can blow my nose, I can swallow, and for the audience, she sat down and then stood up, and she literally had a significant change in gene expression, and it happened in one instant. Now, by the same means, there are people that have had abusive childhoods with alcoholic parents, where they were abused every single day when their father came home from work. And it wasn't just one event. It was a series of several events over time that began to select and instruct genes that caused them to have a rare genetic condition. Now, in this case, this person, it took them almost 2 years to literally consistently knock on the genetic door and break out of the patterns of their normal thinking and the way they typically felt. In other words, every single day, they understood that they were their own genetic engineer, and every single day, they were working on going from the old self to the new self. And of course, life isn't that linear. They had their own stress events, they had their own difficulties, they had their own financial problems, they had family dynamics, and because they were living life, it took them more time. But every day, they were shaving down a little bit more of those emotions from the past and learning how to elevate their emotional state. And they were practicing every single day, combining a clear intention with an elevated emotion and moving into a new state of being. Now, this person's health condition was very limited. They had the very scaffolding and the structure of their bones were degenerating, where they had numerous fractures. And the doctors told them there was no solution for this genetic condition. But if you understand then, if the scaffolding of bones is made of proteins, and that you could actually begin to upregulate those genes, every single day she was knocking on that genetic door and shaving down that emotional state and changing her thoughts and feelings, that in 2 years she reached the point in her life where she was so in love with herself, so in love with life, so grateful to be alive, that she no longer cared if she even had the condition any longer. She went to the hospital. They did the urine samples to determine if the disease was still present, and she got the call the next day that the gene was literally upregulated and her condition was back to normal. Now, this person, to this day, still has the change in her health. Now, when she stood on the stage and told the story to the audience, there was a woman in the audience with the same rare genetic condition. And she looked at that person and said, "If she could do it, I can do it." And this woman reversed the same rare genetic juvenile onset condition within 3 months. In other words, the person who had the healing broke the 4-minute mile, and it made it easier for the next person to do the same. And that's exactly what starts to happen in this work. I believe that health and wellness can become as infectious as disease. Now that I've shown you the supernatural ability of how your genes can be reprogrammed, how can we use this information to heal your body by thought alone? In fact, what's the next level for you? In the next episode, I want to ask the question, if in double-blind and triple-blind placebo studies, where subjects respond to a sugar pill and the changes result from 10% all the way up to 100%, do you really need a sugar pill begin to heal your body? In other words, is it possible to heal your body by thought alone? I'm your host, Dr. Joe Dispenza for Rewired, and I hope to see you in the next episode where we go beyond the ordinary into the extraordinary.
Thank you for watching this original Gaia presentation. You can now start your free trial to Gaia and stream the complete series Rewired with Dr. Joe Dispenza now by clicking our link in the description. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.